Hello, in this series of videos, we'll be covering your tutorial CSQ question 2, which is the NYJC H1 Prelims 2018. This CSQ can be found on page 7 to page 10 of your tutorial worksheet. We would have expected that you already done this, and so I'm going to go through the questions with you today. In the recording videos, we'll be covering question A, B, D, and E. The remaining questions, your individual tutors will bring you through it on your own. Okay, so without further ado, let's just jump straight into question A. And just a gentle reminder, if you have not already done the questions, please pause this video, go and finish your tutorial worksheets before coming back to viewing these videos. Okay, so let's go on to question A. Question A says, using table 1, explain why any one indicator might have been a concern to the Japanese government. When you read a question like this, it's useful to first unpack the concept required of the question. So what does it mean to be concerned? Why would the Japanese government be concerned with certain indicators? It's because of their objectives. So if we have already learned, the macro objective of the government is to maximize the standard of living of its residents. In order to do so, there will be some macro aims that should be met. For example, economic growth, unemployment, and price stability. So if any of these macroeconomic aims are challenged, or if the indicators seem to suggest that there's a problem in any of these aims, or in the problem in the SOL, then it might be that the Japanese government will be concerned with this indicator. Of course, this is from the macro perspective. If you consider the micro aims of the government, you can consider efficiency. This is where you link to market failure, and you can consider equity. These are the micro aims, and again, the logic is very similar. If the indicator suggests that there is some problems with the efficiency of certain markets or inequitable distribution, then there might be a concern to the government. Okay, so let's take a look at the indicators given in table 1 first. Table 1 gives us 4 indicators. The first is GNI per capita, and then we are given for Japan and the US. Then the second indicator is government gross debt to GDP. This is the percentage of debt over your GDP. So the country's GDP is here, and then this is the country's amount of debt times 100%, and it will give you these numbers. Okay. The reason why people like to show it as a ratio is because knowing the absolute amount of debt is actually not very meaningful. If a country is very big, then maybe $100 million debt is not so significant for the country because the country's economy may be worth trillions. So 100 million is very small. But maybe a smaller country, a quite poor country with a small economy, $100 million debt could be a very big part of their GDP, right? So this is a very intuitive way of understanding the burden of the debt. It's very similar to our personal lives. If you're making a little bit more money and you buy a bungalow and you buy a nice car, it's okay. You can take on the loan because you can repay the loan. You have a high income. So the GDP is a proxy for the country's income. So can the countries repay the loan? That's why usually when we talk about debt, it's very meaningful to consider debt as a percentage of your income, that is GDP. Okay. The third indicator is unemployment rate. So there's nothing new here. And then life expectancy at birth. So these are your indicators, and the question asks which of these indicators, and the question says any one indicator. So by right, you can literally choose any one. You can choose either 1, 2, 3, or 4, and it'll be fine. But take note that whatever you choose, you must be able to explain how that is a concern to the government. So be wise with your choice of indicator. Even though the question allows you to pick any indicator you want, you pick the indicator which is easiest to explain. So there are some indicators which are not so meaningful to pick. For example, you probably will not want to pick life expectancy at birth. Why? Why is it so much of a concern to the Japanese government? It's not really, right? Because first we see 84 years is very high. Compared to many other countries, 84 years is one of the highest. And we know that for a fact because Japan's life expectancy is one of the top few in the world. And also we are given the life expectancy of the US, 79. 84 is higher than 79. It would not be very intuitive to say that this indicator is a concern to the government. Okay, So that's just one example. Even though the question allows you to pick any, please choose wisely. Choose the indicator which is the easiest to explain why it's a concern to the government. So let's head back to the question. When you do case study point mark question, a very useful tip is to identify how the marks are being distributed, because that will guide how you answer. So if there are 2 marks here, how do you think the 2 marks are allocated? Well, the first mark is the identification of the indicator. And the second mark is the explanation. But explain what? What about the indicator do you explain? Just caution you here, most students when they explain, describe the indicator. So for example, if you choose life expectancy, then you'll say, oh, life expectancy measures this. This is the definition of life expectancy. That is describing the indicator. We don't really want to have a description of the indicator alone. The focus is, even if you do describe it, and perhaps you should unpack the indicator, but you should focus on explaining why that is a concern to the Japanese government. So you must link to a government objective that is challenged. Right? This is the crucial part, and this is the reason why many students miss out the second mark. They lack the link. So the description of the indicator is quite easy. If you did study for the paper, you will be able to rehash a definition, but it is the link. Explain why that is a concern. Okay? So let's answer this question now properly. To me, the indicator that really is a concern for the Japanese government is this. What's the reason? 250.4%. What does it mean? Look at the way it is calculated, right? If it's 250, does it mean that debt is bigger or smaller than GDP? It means it's bigger, right? Because the debt is 2.5 times of GDP. That is what this indicator is telling us. As compared to the US government gross debt of GDP is 105. So that is about 1 for 1. It's about the same size as the GDP of the US for this variable. But for the Japan, it's 250%. So this huge debt should be a concern. Okay, so let's answer the question. So you identify the indicator, the gross government debt to GDP of Japan is very large at 250%. This should be a concern to the Japanese government. If you want to, you can also cite that this is about twice the size of the US debt to GDP ratio. Okay, so you identify the indicator and be very explicit when you identify. Really copy down the name of the indicator. Don't rename it. Just whatever the table 1 uses. So here table 1 says government gross debt to GDP. Then you say government gross debt to GDP, right? So just take the entire indicator name and plug it in your answer. So there's no ambiguity. So that is very clearly the indicator. And then you're saying, what about that indicator? So it is 250%, which is very large. So this indicator is taking on a very large number, and you can compare it either through plugging in the absolute value 250 or compared to the size of the US. Okay, so explain, why is this such a concern to the government? Well, because it might reduce the material standard of living for the future generation of Japanese residents. Okay, so this is the point you're making. You're linking it to the concern of the government. this is the government's objective, right? You want to maximize material SOL, but if this indicator suggests that your material SOL may be challenged, or in this case, challenge means will not be maximized, it might reduce it, then that is a concern. Then the next step is why? How come you say the material SOL will likely be reduced? Well, because a large debt to GDP ratio, ratio may place a large burden to repay the debt for future generations. So the keyword is burden to repay the debt. And then this will mean that for this future generation, they might have less disposable income after repaying debt. Okay? So just take note on how the explanation is. You are really trying to explain why the indicator is a concern. So a very useful tip is to always link it back to an explicit objective of the government. And in this case, I'm linking it back to the material standard of living, which is the macro objective of the government, and I'm saying that it will be reduced, and explain how come this large indicator might suggest material SOL will fall. And so this is the explanation, this is the intuition to link us to that, right? So I just want to recap this so that you avoid this mistake, which is where most students fall. They don't draw a link to the indicator that they mentioned. Okay, I can imagine at this juncture, some of you all might have a question. Since the question says, can it use any indicator, can we really use any other indicator? Anyone we want, can. I have actually already answered this earlier. I said yes, can. It is true, it is possible. But, and this is the key caveat, just a reminder again, whatever you use, you must be able to explain why these are concerned to the government. The reason why I did not choose the other three is because I feel it's not very meaningful, very difficult to explain why it's a concern to the government. Life expectancy is higher than the US, is one of the top in the world. Why would that be a concern? Not very logical. GNI is 47,000 per capita, which is relatively high, higher than many other countries, just a bit short of the US. Again, not very meaningful. And especially since they don't give us GDP data, if they do give you GDP and then they give you GNI and there's a very big discrepancy, maybe your GNI is a lot smaller than your GDP, yeah, then maybe you can say that, oh, it's a concern to the government because there might be very large net outflow of income from Japan. That is possible, but they don't give us GDP variables, so not very meaningful to make that point. Then unemployment, again, 3% is relatively low. It's kind of historically kind of the employment rate that we would expect to see the economies to be in, and also because it's not a very, very big difference from that of the US. So I feel that these three other variables, while possible, would be a very weak answer. So the best answer, since you are given the best variable, choose the best variable, and that variable is gross government debt to GDP ratio. Okay, stay tuned for the next questions.